physics panel each year so that it corresponds to covering 2 different segments of classes. So because of that bridge strategy, students will come and go, and we understand that. So not to worry, if you've got to get on to your next class, that's fine. The only thing I'd ask you to do is leave as quietly as possible. And it'd be better if you're on this side to come around the back to go out. That would be helpful because we do have cameras up front that we're using today. Since this is the 10th anniversary, well, certainly we are continuing in our tradition of having a reception that starts at 5 o'clock. And as I said earlier, generally we are on time, and for that reason, we are starting at this point. That reception is behind the screen, so you don't have to go very far to attend the reception itself. We do have at least one of our deans here today, and I would like to introduce him. It is Dr. Brian Simmons, and he has joined us today. Would you stand up, Brian? Here's Brian, okay. And Brian is the Dean of the College of Professional Studies, and that's the college to which we belong as the School of Business. Now, I don't think I see Marsha Moreau here today, do I? No, I don't. Okay. How about Eric Tell? Has anybody seen Eric today? Reason for calling those 2 names out especially is because of the panel this year is co-sponsored by both ourselves as well as the School of Technology and ITCD is what we call it. So that is an annual annual thing that we do is to have a co-sponsor. So the School of Information Technology and Communication Design is, ITCD is also sponsoring this event with us. This year's theme, as all of you know, hopefully you've picked up brochures, which are important to you. I know the students especially will need those brochures, is caution, digital big brothers are tracking. Is that ethical? Well, certainly, as our phones have become smarter and we get tied to the net 24/7, all of us are digitally observable. As many of you know, Big Brother entered our vocabulary with the science fiction book by George Orwell called 1984. And Big Brother, the head of the totalitarian government of Oceania in the book, was capable of doing mass surveillance using technology. And today, as we explore how pervasive our technologies are, used by business and government, it's apropos to use the word Big Brother. And the question therefore becomes, do we, as citizens, need to be concerned about this? And more specifically, what are the critical ethical dilemmas that these technologies pose? Our guest speaker is eminently qualified to speak on these particular subject areas. Mr. Lee Tien is the senior staff attorney of a group called Electronic Frontier Foundation, a non-for-profit group located in San Francisco. EFF for short started in 1990. That's just about when the World Wide Web was beginning to take off. And as the EFF website says, when our freedoms in a networked world becomes under attack, the Electronic Frontier Foundation is the first line of defense. I recommend to our students, as you write your reflection papers on this subject today, that you refer to the Electronic Frontier Foundation's website. It just has a host of information on this subject. And oh, by the way, for any of you who are technology students, EFF is looking for a web designer. So if you need a job after graduation, you might want to check the website out on that basis as well. I don't know if that's still open, Lee, but most certainly I saw it on the website today. Oh, they're not going to wait that long, which is about a month and a half to 2 months. So, but they're actively looking for talent from time to time. So check the website out, especially if this is an area of interest for you. Needless to say, the Electronic Frontier Foundation is a vigilant watchdog over citizens' rights in our connected cyber-based digital world. And on that note, I want to welcome Lee Tien as our guest speaker.
Well, as should be obvious, I'm going to be talking about the ethics of data mining, which I'm going to call semi-affectionately big data. And big data is a form of Big Brother. And one of the things that we are concerned about today, or should be concerned about in the foreseeable future, is not just sort of the metaphor that we're all used to of Big Brother watching you. Because Big Brother has a memory. It doesn't just see what you're doing and then forget it after 5 minutes. Big data is about all of the data every day, every week, every month that gets compiled about us. Now, this is sort of my 4 basic points today, so I always like to get an overview first. And the first point is that because there's so much of this data about us, there's enormous demand. And yet that data about us, data about people especially, because we have strong human interests in that data. And note that I didn't say privacy or even a personal interest, because I think the interests are even broader. Okay? Medical health data is a really good example of that. So that demand for data about us leads to a basic ethical issue, which is who's in charge. All this demand for data, I suggest, tends to minimize the role of persons as deciders, as autonomous individuals who are able to decide what happens to their data. I'm concerned about the rise of persons as mere data objects to be analyzed and studied. And, you know, for short, I always call this the problem of objectification. So point 3, we also are dealing with changes in how we live, including technological innovation. But part of what that means is that people often have no idea what information is being collected about them, who collects it, whom they tell, what they do with it. And worst of all, they might not even realize that information about them is being collected in the first place, or what could be done with it. And I always think of my mother-in-law, who's a very, very avid web surfer and uses the internet a lot, even though she's, you know, in her early 80s. But I know that she doesn't have a clue as to how clickstream data gets collected, the vast network of third-party surveillance entities that line on websites, who is collecting her online reading habits. And so that leads to the very basic point of when you have a lot of people who are being subjected to this kind of monitoring online or in their daily lives, but they do not know what the implications of any of that is. Is that fair? And I think that's one of the most basic ethical questions we have. And you know, so we're dealing with an effect of asymmetric information or asymmetric knowledge. So in the old days, I think what Irving Goffman says here was very true. And the idea here, Goffman was a sociologist. He wrote this in 1961 at the dawn of the rise of computer databases. But it was true that, you know, you might know something about someone and someone else would know something about someone. And even in today's world, although we have Facebook and social media and Google, which allows a lot more sort of flattening and a lot more access to information about people, it's still the case that when we sort of think of each other as ordinary people, that, yeah, you know, I know a bit of this and somebody else knows a bit of that. But it's different when we look at the institutional level, when we look at the government level, when we look at the corporate level. There are vast databases, data broker companies that are exchanging all all sorts of information about us. And so this sort of idea of, gee, being able to have a sort of a different face in one place to another is eroding. So what is big data? We've already talked about this a little bit. But basically it's lots and lots of data and increasingly cheaper analytical and storage power. You know, that's just one statistic. I could have picked a dozen. All of the devices, they're transferring information all the time. Each transaction, each packet leaves a trace. This is, you know, the stuff of big data. And as Eric Schmidt of Google famously said in 2010, you know, every 2 days now we create as much information as we did from the dawn of civilization up until 2003. Now, a lot of that data doesn't really have much to do with individuals. It might be scientific data, climate data, geological data, astronomical, biological, and you know, we don't have the same kinds of ethical problems about doing that kind of research, of studying the patterns that happen in the natural world that we do when we're talking about people. Now, obviously, one good example here that I particularly like is just how much data just mammograms in the U.S. Creates. That's an enormous amount of data. But of course, we see that Google itself, whether it's, I think, Gmail or Google Search or any of their various apps, handles even more data every day. And much of this data, we can say, is user-generated. It means credit card transactions, it means clickstream data, it means cell phone and mobile phone usage, it means medical records, et cetera, et cetera. This is an example of, this slide and the next will give you an example of how data distribution has changed in a relatively short period of time. Because this is what health data flows looked like a while ago. In 2010, and this data comes from a National Academy of Sciences study on electronic health records, you can see that there's way, way more entities getting a hold of your health records. And obviously there's going to be much, much more data like the medical mammograms we were talking about a moment ago. And the reason, and I pick on the category of health data because it's something where, on the one hand, there is an enormous amount of interest in it, an enormous amount of scientific and health and public health research reasons why we might want to have it analyzed. But at the same time, it's among the most sensitive types of information that there can be about us. And it's not just about us as individuals, right? If somebody knows something about me, they probably know things about my family, and depending on the type of data they have, it's always going to be sort of there's a social graph aspect to it. So here's some simple examples, I think, of what we think about when we're talking about the data mining aspect of it. There was I think everyone's pretty familiar with these, but you know, whether it's the recommender system. And then Target was the subject of a recent news story where that was really into sort of habit formation, but it went into how Target could mine its data and figure out, based on the kinds of shopping data that it had, correlations with whether or not a woman was going to be pregnant. And so then they would look based on that data and then begin to send or contact women a few months before or right at the right time so that they would be able to shift them into wanting to buy things at Target that otherwise would not have bought there. And there's a great bit in the story where a father angrily contacts Target and says, what the hell are you doing? And then later
said, okay, I guess there were some things that were going on that I didn't know about. And one of the things that I like about the Target example is that it shows how easily things that seem innocuous, like patterns of purchases at a store, can reveal something that, at least for women in my generation, they're very, very careful not to tell anyone about a pregnancy until they're absolutely sure, and until they think that they're ready and that the world is ready. And yet, the idea that a retailer can make inferences about something that sensitive and then has the total sort of power and discretion to decide who they're going to tell and how they're going to use it is something that I think should give us all pause. The other examples are, old ones. If you remember all the issues around 9/11 and the Patriot Act, one of the things that we were very worried about was that this Total Information Awareness Program was going to engage in a lot of large-scale data mining to try to find out who might be a terrorist. And I think the important thing here to remember is that the things we discover through data mining are not always, well, they're not facts, right? They're suspicions, they're inferences, they're correlations, they're patterns, but we do not know for sure whether or not they are true. But things can nevertheless happen, and bad things can happen to people based simply on our belief or our belief that something is likely to be true. I mean, if you are believed to be a terrorist, there are things that are going to happen. Similarly with DNA analysis. They won't know for sure, but maybe you carry a few of those genes that have been closely associated with breast cancer. Is that something that you should have control over, or is that something that whoever figures it out should have control over? And so in all of these cases, we can think of reasons why someone might want to know these things about you, and we can also think of reasons why you might not want someone to know them, or at least why you should have meaningful control over who can know them. And this is why I say this is not just a privacy issue, because an employer knowing about your pregnancy or your predisposition to cancer may treat you very differently. And since my daughters have some of my genes, anything someone knows about my genetic makeup is going to generate inferences or lead to something about them. So is it even correct to say that I should be the one to say, yes, I'd like to have my genes sequenced when it has very, very clear foreseeable impacts on them? And part of why I like the health example as well is because it shows that Big Brother in the form of big data is big business. There is an enormous amount of money chasing medical information, not just genetic, but medical information in general. And so you have these kinds of cautionary tales in the world of medical ethics right now about how university researchers who have stored tissue samples or stored data would then violate consent requirements and go ahead and examine this data again, or use it for some other purpose, and they'll get sued. If anyone's ever read The Immortal Life of Henry L. Laxman knows about this book. This is a very old example of how a woman and her family, entire sort of her cells were special, and Johns Hopkins University basically monetized herself without her consent, without ever really telling her about it, and billions of dollars, millions of dollars have been made off of that. And so earlier I showed the slide about Erving Goffman's approach to how we were back then. And this is Mark Zuckerberg's approach. Rather than the idea that we show different faces to different people, Zuckerberg wanted to say that we are only one person, and that for us to be And I think he's sort of saying, you know, me to be a different person to my wife than to my coworkers or to someone I meet on the street somehow is a loss of integrity. Obviously, I think that's wrong. Google, and this is a quote from an article that a couple of Google employees wrote, has a sort of a different argument about big data. And basically, it's saying that, well, it's taking a very utilitarian approach. Maybe big data will help solve the great social problems of our world. And if that's the case, wouldn't it be terrible to let privacy get in the way? And this, I think, you know, sort of is the ultimate end, or the conclusion to that sort of line of thinking that I call objectification. It leads to paternalism. It leads to saying that, well, we don't actually care whether you want us or don't want us to be able to mine your data. We'll do it anyway because it's good for everyone. So I'm going to just sort of move on to my second set of points, because I'm running out of time, which is about how the technology has changed. And so this slide, and the main purpose of it is to show you how messy the world of data is, even in something like the health industry. I work in this health data privacy area a lot, so we try to map information flows just so that we can be clear on where the data goes. And as you can see, it's incredibly messy. And my point is really simple. Whether or not people, even if you agree with me on the first point that people really should have a right to decide what happens to their information, they may not know enough or have enough information or power to actually exercise any control. I mean, you have consent rights in the area of medical, but when most people are not going to say, but gee, I want to exercise all this control because you want to be treated for whatever it is you are seeing the doctor for. It's not a really meaningful consent if you feel like you have to do this in order to get healthy. And similarly, most people have no idea how the internet works and how much data about your online activities is generated and collected. A really awesome researcher at Microsoft named Dana Boyd, she's done a lot of work on social media and how teens and young people manage their identities. And she said, a while back, I was talking with a teenage girl about her privacy settings and noticed that she had made a lot of content available to friends of friends. And I asked her if she made her content available to her mother, and she said, of course not. But I had noticed that she had listed her aunt as a friend of hers. And so I searched with her to her aunt's page and pointed out that her mother was a friend of her aunt, thus a friend of a friend. She was horrified. It had never dawned on her that her mother might be included in that grouping. So, obviously there are a lot of implications to not understanding how your data is moving, even on something like Facebook, much less in this kind of environment. And so I think that raises an enormous question about what is actually fair to people. And I think the biggest there are a lot of things you can talk about in terms of whether the collection is fair, whether disclosure is fair, whether the use of that information is fair. And we all can think of ways in which we wouldn't want our landlord to know something, or we wouldn't want our boss to know something, and then use it against us. But the most maybe more important, and at a most more insidious level, is the idea that when we're kept in the dark, we can't exercise meaningful control. So there are, I think, not only is there demand for data about us, but there are incentives on the part of the companies and the government to keep us, who are the objects of desire when it comes to being analyzed and extracting data, to keep us from knowing what we need to know and how we can control information flows. And so, as Ronald Reagan used to say, trust but verify. Right now, we don't have the verify part in our system very well at all. So I'm going to tail off here because I'm running out of time. But after having about the really complex things, I want to talk about something really simple, which is that a lot of what is going on in this ethics of data is really still, at the end of the day, not a lot harder conceptually than what you should have learned in kindergarten. But these basic, simple sort of rules are not regularly followed. We are not asked first if our data can be used or can be collected. We are often not told what is going to be done with it, at least not in a language we can understand. We have no easy way to determine whether someone has in fact done what they said they would with the data. All the data breaches we hear about show us that they don't really take care of it while they have it. And the fact that data piles and piles and piles on, instead of being destroyed or eliminated once the use is over, is not exactly giving it back when you're done. So, this is my summary, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Lee, for providing us some excellent points this afternoon as we explore some very, very important points with our panelists today. I'd like to remind everyone that and I think we'll have we do have a couple of microphones here. We have questions that will be moderated in a few minutes, however, by Chip. However, if you would like to ask a question from the floor, just come up to the microphone, just stay right there, and Chip will get to you to ask your question. So many of you, I'm sure, have some burning questions that you'd like to ask. Now, let me introduce Jeff Froshman, who's going to be making his way up to the podium, right, Jeff? He is our distinguished lecturer in the School of Business, and he will be introducing our panelists and our moderator today. And Jeff as he comes to the podium, let me just say that I'm very proud to count Jeff not only as a colleague, but as a dear friend. He has supported the School of Business financially as well as with his talents as a teacher. He has a soft spot for our students, but is zealous about their learning. Students tell me that they have to produce in Jeff's class because as a dollar and cents guy, he wants to see the results. And I think that's very, very true about Jeff. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jeff Froshman. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's my 10th year here also being up at the podium saying hello and welcome to everybody who's here. I especially want to take this opportunity to thank the students, the faculty, administration, and friends of the university for taking the time and attending this terrific, terrific conference, and many, many more to come in the future. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest panelists this evening. Our first panelist, all the way down, is Alec Arago. Alec is U.S. Representative Sam Farr's District Director. Alec oversees the Congressman's district staff and works with them and the Congressman in assisting constituents throughout the 17th Congressional District that includes Monterey, San Benito, and Santa Cruz counties. His policy work for Representative Farr focuses on agricultural, environmental, and military installation issues. So, welcome, Alec. Our second panelist is Cheryl Washington. Cheryl is the Chief Information Security and Privacy Officer for the University of California. Cheryl leads the development and implementation of a comprehensive system-wide information security and privacy program that supports the academic, research, and public service mission of the university. She works closely with faculty, staff, and management to implement strategies to protect, personal and institutional informational assets. Prior to joining the University of California, Cheryl served as the Chief Information Security Officer for California State University. So, Cheryl, welcome. Our third panelist is William Boogess. William was the CIO for the Defense Manpower Data Center. He has 30 years experience designing and implementing automated information systems, both with the government and with private businesses. William is a frequent speaker at conferences on the topics of smart cards, biometrics, privacy, and security. Welcome, William. Our fourth distinguished panelist is Adam Swidler. Adam is a senior manager in Google's Enterprise Division, responsible Google app security, privacy, and compliance. Adam joined Google with the acquisition of Postini. Prior to Postini, William was the director of product management for Vendavo, in charge of the pricing and margin management application suite. He has over 20 years of experience in enterprise IT solutions, with the last 6 focused on IT security. So Adam, we're very pleased to have you. Lastly, I would like to introduce our esteemed 2012 Ethics Panel Moderator, Dr. Chip Lenno, the Chief Information Officer at CSU Monterey Bay.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Mary Lou. Thank you, Brian. Switch this on. I'd like to start off, after having listened to Lee's talk here. We've got a distinguished panel here. They all have very varied backgrounds with regard to privacy and security. So what I'd like to do is start at the far end with Alec and get your perspective from kind of the political perspective.
I can say my own personal. My dad and my struggle is trying to keep my 13-year-old daughter off Facebook and stuff like that. I think we just keep our house on dial-up. It seems to be the most successful. But, I think that's kind of a metaphor for how this is evolving in Congress. I think I'm not a subject matter expert in this. I don't know if my bio. They were bugging me about a bio. I got something on my in my file and I shouted something. I didn't know what it was, so I did that for something else. But I don't have any subject matter expertise in this. But I worked on Capitol Hill. I've been working for Congress, House, Senate for 20 years now. So I got a good view of sort of how mechanics work, irrespective of what particular piece is getting chewed up and made into sausage. And this is one of these issues. I jotted down as well. I said, the policy infrastructure for how this gets dealt with, it's sort of mid-20th century architecture. And you try to think of, you've got, House and Senate, Congress. It's sort of modern. If you're thinking of the late 18th century, it's pretty innovative for the 1790s, and we really haven't changed it since then. Having these committees, various committees trying to divide up this issue and struggle with it. I'll talk about the House of Representatives. The House, the piece that deals with most of the committee that deals with most of this stuff is the House Commerce Committee, which is gigantic and also deals with trucking regulation and air pollution and 1,000 other things. But it's sort of an imperfect. By its nature, American politics is often very reactive. So, we're certainly going to have bills about not having to give your Facebook passwords over to employers, but it's not really necessarily dealing with the problem systematically. Mr. Tien can get much more. He's probably got a math for this. I'm just making it up as I go. But the other pieces of the federal bureaucracy that deal with this issue, FTC, Federal Trade Commission, Securities and Exchange Commission, we're dealing with financial information. The new Consumer Protection Bureau, we're trying to figure out exactly how this would deal with this. But the point I'm trying to make is that this issue of data mining, which can handle on what it is. I mean, this is what's interesting about this problem. It's a very simple problem to understand. It's not, there's not really, I think, a big empirical challenge of understanding, well, what is it? I mean, it's every time I click on something, I'm sitting here playing with this, someone knows what I'm doing. I'm sure Google was, because I was on Google. So, or the house, phone account, Verizon, and everybody else can do it. So we understand, I think it's easy to understand. It's how socially do you deal with that? Because the hinted at, there's a lot of utility in this, of understanding, and someone's going to throw a rock at me when I stop talking, so I'm going to rely on that rock coming in from stage left to tell me when to stop. But there's a lot of utility in this. Medical records. There was I think you've seen the news. Just down the street here, there's a VA clinic. That's a residual from when this used to be Fort Ord. We've just gotten the VA to announce a brand new clinic out by next to Best Buy down the road here. That's going to be joined with a DoD clinic, which is fairly unique. Usually there are DoD family clinics and VA clinics, and they don't in the same building. We've been pushing to have them in the same building. We finally got, it's kind of like pushing the two positive ends of a magnet together. One still, you push it a little closer, the other moves away. So it's been about a 5-year process. We've got the Army and DA on board in this. And now the VA secretary wants to announce this last week. He says, I want to take this next level. I want to make sure I want this clinic to be a pilot in kind of a seamless medical delivery. So we want to make sure that DoD families and VA patients see the same doctor. And by the way, I want this to be the pilot project for a unified medical record system between the military and VA. So for those of you who are veterans in the room, I'm sure you had to deal with the clusterfuck that was. I'm out of the Army or Marine Corps now, and I've got my medical records going to the VA and trying to get the two systems to match. Well, it's that problem's been solved in a lot of other contexts, and we're going to try to solve that in this context. Raises this whole thinking about the math of the medical health data. All right, well, now you have two agencies owning your medical data, and how is that the transition? Those are problems in this whole medical data, electronic medical records with federal health or privacy protection laws and what it allows you to do and cannot do. And it may be that the Secretary's grand vision will crash on the rungs of HIPAA for good reasons or bad reasons or different reasons. But I guess the point I'm trying to make, and I'll stop it. It just is at the federal policy level, it's very fragmented and a challenge to deal with this issue systematically. That may be a bad thing. You think, oh, this is a problem, we need to solve it systematically. It may be a good thing because it won't get solved systematically and therefore won't get screwed up systematically. I mean, I think it helps. Sometimes it helps to deal with these things in pieces as it evolves and people's understanding evolves. But I think the political policy perspective, and certainly, it's just a federal problem. I mean, states will nip at it here and there, but it's really, the state's not well placed to make an effective run at this issue. I think at the federal level, it starts, it's probably for the last 5 years, or probably for the next 10 years, you probably see, maybe my timeline's off, but piecemeal nipping at it. And there will be, like I said, the Facebook can't give your password to an employer question, and that then becomes a law. And suddenly, how does that match with, I don't know, I applied for security, but we were having this conversation. William may know about it. You have this sense. There's a little office here in Monterey County. It's part of the Secretary with the Department of Defense. It just is about improving the security clearance process. So if you go out and you look for an agency, you got to get security clearance. It's costly. It takes forever. It's a pain in the butt. And yet they get it renewed every 5 years. That's efficient, costly, et cetera, slow. And this group was all about improving that and making it more efficient and so forth. But in that whole security clearance review process, they do not look at social media. There's no policy with the DoD to how to do that, so they don't do it. It's something that probably will happen in the future. They're going to struggle with it. But I was thinking the irony, because I was having this conversation, I said, we don't. And he said, well, we haven't figured out a policy to do these hundreds of thousands of these security clearances a year. No, we don't. I mean, we'll mine your bank data and make sure you don't have a Swiss bank account. Suddenly get lots of money in a Swiss bank account from some source in North Korea or Iran or someplace. But no, we're not looking at your Facebook page and finding out that you're posting on this or that website that, you know, saying things that you're going to rip off the government or sell your secrets to whoever. We don't do that. And I'm thinking the irony that, you know, what was it GameStop or some company was asking someone for their Facebook password, not just going and looking at their website and seeing if they were, you know, drunk at that college party. I'm sure that never happens. But was actually asking for their password and their I don't even do that with my daughter. So, but yet here's this company doing it, but you know, the DoD, you know, you think it was the most intrusive of these entities, doesn't, because they haven't figured out policy. So I'm waiting for that rise. Is the rock coming?
I'll throw a rock at it.
But I'll stop at that point.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned the VA-DoD piece of it, getting different organizations to talk to one another, because I think Cheryl can speak to that, having come from a 23 campus system and now at a 10 campus system, just within those systems, getting different organizations to talk to one another about security and privacy.
Absolutely. I don't know if this is on. Can everyone hear me? What struck me about the presentation was that there's another side to the picture. And it's from my perspective, what those of us who call ourselves security professionals tend to do is when we see or hear about opportunities for organizations who want to form data mining or share information with outside parties, what we often do is kind of ensure that there are appropriate controls in place to protect information. I'm struck by the presentation, as I said. Most of what I heard was quite true even in higher education. We do have a vast amount of information about students, about employees, about business associates, and so forth. But our job as security professionals is to ensure that there are protections in place to ensure that that information is used for the purpose that it was collected and that it is protected as it is in our stewardship. So there is another side to this story, and hopefully we can get into a little more detail as the discussion proceeds.
Okay, and William, before we started, we were having a conversation, and William mentioned that he worked with a very large data set of employee records for the military. And Alec mentioning security clearance, I'm remembering about 15 or 20 years ago when I went for my security clearance. I wonder if they still have all of that documentation and they're not mining it. So.
You want to answer that? So talking about this, coming from a government agency, the Department of Defense, for the Secretary of Defense, it's clear to me that one of the things that we need to go, and I think this is part of the call that we heard earlier from Lee, was that, you know, our privacy law is really out of date. You know, people voted the Privacy Act of 1974. Okay? 1974 was pushing 1960 when he was talking about computers were just starting. So I think it needs to be updated to deal with more current realities out there. I think that goes beyond saying, I think probably what Alex was talking about, there's two kinds of policies. And often people in Washington get hung up on saying, not to talk to policy makers, they're a specialty. People say, I write policy, okay? Nothing starts until a policy is written. Policy is creational. Okay, so until I have a policy, I can't go get to Facebook because there's no policy saying I can go to Facebook to do data mining. It's a creational step. Well, in areas like medicine and IT, I think there's a very much stronger need for another type of policy. For lack of a better way, we're not really known for naming things. I call it thou shalt not. I think if you take a look at the medical profession, we saw that we started cloning one-cell creatures and we moved up to cats and dogs and sheep and cows. And somebody finally drew a line and said, hey, wait, whoa, stop. Before we get to humans, maybe we ought to have a policy saying this is not a good idea. You're cloning humans out there. And I think the same thing's true with IT that is going so fast that we need to have breakers in there to say, wait, we need to stop and take a unified look at these things. So, and I think the threat is much larger than it's ever been in the past, and that with the type of mashup tools now, some of the things that were limited only to people who were DBAs and had the tools to go in and mine big databases. Now you don't have to have a big database. Mashup tools are giving you big database-like capabilities where you can take lots of separate files of it. One systems person map all the files into a virtual database and start pulling data like mad just from an analyst. And not only can you pull the data, you can merge the data. You can merge it 2 or 3 times by different features or different fields in the records. And then you can filter it, say, I don't want to see all of the data, I only want to see these. And then you can publish the data and have choices for publishing are just infinite. If your system has telephony capability, you can publish it to your friend's iPhone and say, look at what I just found here in most of this data. And it's gone, it's off the premises, it's gone being shared out there. So I think that there's lots of threats of losing privacy. We need to concentrate more on improving, getting a better grasp on what privacy is out there. I think, just quickly here, that there are things that we can do. We can do better jobs in programming and IT. We can make screens more restrictive so that the screen's designed for the user that's looking at it, and not take the simple way out and just put all the data on one screen and tell everybody to use the same screen, even though there's much more data than the person needs. I mean, if you think about it, you don't even need your name on your boarding pass. Really what you need is your seat and you and a boarding pass, right? The stewardess comes down, she doesn't need to know your name, she just needs to know you're sitting in the right seat. The guy out at the gate needs to know that you're on the roster and that you're the right name on the roster, but not on, it doesn't have to be printed out on your boarding passes. And there's hundreds of those things happening daily that we need to pull back and say, why? Why are you asking for this data? Why are you printing this data? We need to separate the data. We need to get the sensitive data away from the identity data. And there's lots of methods for this, but there isn't a standard norm for best practices for separating data out there. Mostly the professionals in privacy, and I've been beating my head, especially in government, which is my experience on it, don't know anything about IT or security. Yeah, they're for writing the policy, they're for thinking about what's really necessary, what are the big thoughts on privacy, but they don't know where all the data is being stored or how it's being secured, and they keep it private. And they have no concept. They turn off. They say, oh, I've always been told that I'm not technical, so you start talking technicals about talking about portals and even ancient technology like portals and phone technology and how data is going, and they snap off because I'm just a policy person. I talk privacy and I know privacy law, but that's all I talk about. And that's a big problem. That's a huge problem out there. Lastly, I think, just to toss it out, and I think this was partially touched on out there, was that we had a saying, because we had lots of data. We had records on 34 million people, which is about 10% of the United States that we monitored and did. And we had a saying that we had plastered all over: treat the data as if it's your own. Now, underlying that is an assumption that we all have the same moral code and value and way of respecting data. And I think that's something we're going to have to work on in the future to make sure that we're all coming from the same place and we have all the same perspective on how we treat and preserve privacy. Thanks.
Thanks, William. Adam?
So, a couple things that I'd like to talk about. So, first of all, I thought Lee's presentation was excellent. I think that we're in a very interesting time right now, particularly with technology, and some people would say that it's eroding our privacy. On the other hand, I read an article in the IAPP, which is the Association of Privacy Professionals, that talked about how we've never had more defenders of privacy than we do today. In fact, I was at a certification exam in Washington 3 or 4 weeks ago. There were 1,000 people getting certified in their understanding of privacy laws and best practices. So, I mean, I think that's the right reaction, in other words. We're clearly in a new age. I think it's pretty clear that while there's agreement that legislation and policy efforts on the part of lawmakers should be changed to address some of this new technology, I think it's pretty clear that it's very difficult for legislation to keep up with the technology. The technology is evolving so rapidly. The other thing that, of course, is a challenge is that the internet is a totally global phenomenon, right? So then you have the question of jurisdiction, and that makes things very complicated from a policy and a regulatory perspective. So I think that what that means is there's an incredible onus on us to users, and I'm in that group too, of course, to do our best to understand how is the data that we share being used? What are our options to control the sharing of that data? What are the policies of the companies that we choose to use? Some of you may have heard, actually, let me ask, how many of you in the room heard something about Google changing our privacy policy recently? Okay, so that's good. Hopefully, that's we've been working hard to get that out in the news, and the media's been helping us with that. So I think it's great that there's huge awareness that we've changed our policy. Let me ask you this, how many of you have actually read our new privacy policy? We've got a few. So one of the big things that we did, and I invite people to come up and ask me questions about this, but one of the big things that we did was take what was previously 60 different privacy policies across all of our different products, Google Search, YouTube, Gmail, we have a lot of different things out there, and we consolidated them down into one. So the good news is you now only need to read one policy if you really want to know how we treat your data, what we do with it, etc. We also tried really hard to make it intelligible to non-lawyers. Any non-lawyers in the room? So when you read it, you will call me out and say, well, this was clearly written by a lawyer, because it's obvious that it was. But I do believe that if you look at some of the other comparable privacy notices that are out there from some of the other vendors, I think you'll definitely conclude that ours is easier to understand. Easier doesn't necessarily mean easy. But it's important to take a look at that. And that's really, I think, my point here is that some of these questions you can get to it. You may hope that the governments are going to legislate this problem away for you, but they're not. And certainly not completely, right? They have to do, I think, a certain amount. They certainly have to go after out-and-out fraudulent and illegal activities that people may be doing with your data, right? So a lot of that is in the realm of the health data, a lot of that is in the realm of the financial services, the truly clearly sensitive and legally protected data. But then I think there's a whole gray area, if you will, about personal information that is not technically classified as sensitive, that you need to take some responsibility for understanding what you're sharing with companies, what they say they're going to do with it, transparency into that they actually do what they say. And then again, I love the closing slide. It turns out like everything you ever needed to know in life you learned in kindergarten. And make sure that those vendors take care of your data and then have an opportunity for you to get that data back. And I look forward to talking more about how we do it, as well as how some of the other vendors in the space are doing that stuff today.
Thanks, Adam. One of the things that I was thinking, listening to everybody speak about in terms of the different perspectives, and there's a couple of questions in the pre-submitted ones that lend itself towards a thread that there actually is a shared responsibility here. And we have a personal responsibility as users of these services. The companies that we're dealing with have a corporate responsibility. Politicians have policy responsibilities, the judges. So I'd like to get, where do you kind of all fall and what is the distribution of that responsibility? I mean, how many people are supposed to go through and read all of those end user license agreements and terms and conditions?
More than are in this room.
Right, and it's part of my job. I do that because I need to, but I know my mother and my siblings certainly don't, and they probably have no clue what's being done with their data.
And part of what we do as those in the trenches is to help educate them and raise awareness. Honestly speaking, my own mother will not read a privacy policy, but she'll surf the net all day long. But she will rely on me if she finds herself in a predicament that she might not anticipate it. And right there, holding her hand and trying to unravel the latest virus that she placed on her machine every week. So there's shared responsibility, and it goes outside of our profession. We are professionals, and we have intimate knowledge in this area. Sometimes we're aware of threats that most individuals aren't aware of, and the best that we can do is keep that awareness level high so that we're all protecting one another.
Right. So that's and Cheryl and I have worked together over the years, and so we do share a certain sense of responsibility for educating our user populations. But
we're in higher education. So
yeah. But the question I'd like to ask Lee and Adam a little bit more specifically is, what responsibilities do corporations have with the businesses that we're dealing with to help us better understand? I mean, your terms and conditions, you say you try to make them simpler, and after you've read 50 or 60 of them, they do get a little easier to understand. But I think for the average person, do we need to try to push for policies or legislation that we've done? Hawaii, for example, has a English law for a lot of their legal documents. Do we need to try to move that way policy direction-wise so that people can be more responsible in their own action?
You mind if I jump on that first? I think there's the whole reason why in my presentation I talked about the ethics of information asymmetry or power asymmetry is because I think it's actually asking too much of the average person to be able to know many of these things. There are folks who have written in this area, in the privacy literature, who estimate that if you were to read in order to actually read all the privacy policies of the sites and entities that you deal with, it would be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours every year or something, which it's not. There's a scale problem here, right? You might imagine yourself doing it, but does it make sense to put on the hundreds of millions of people that use the internet the responsibilities to keep track of everything that every company is doing? In economics, or certainly at least in the law and economics field, we have this sort of notion of who's the cheapest cost avoider, right? Or in the law, when we talk about who should have the burden of proof to do something, to prove something, it's usually the entity that knows the most. So part of what I'm pushing at is that when you have conditions of really seriously asymmetric information, usually the answer, you can have the answer of saying, yes, the ones who don't know should educate themselves or get educated, but certainly in the short run, that means that the responsibility and accountability ought to be on the people who actually know what they're doing, especially because, and this is the other sort of point I try to anticipate, is that there are incentives to keep people in the dark because then they won't be able to protect themselves. And you don't have to lie to people to keep them in the dark. You just have to be sort of confusing. I mean, when Facebook did a lot of its major changes in its privacy policy, we published in one of our blog posts on EFF a Facebook to English translator because they used words like private and public in ways that no one who speaks English would understand. You had to analyze a whole bunch of documents and put together a whole bunch of definitions to figure out when they said this is public, what that really meant, or private. And that's not reasonable, right? I mean, it's not reasonable at all to expect individuals to have to figure that out. And so the other side of it is, I'll appeal to, I'm a lawyer, and I try not to talk about the law, appeal to the law at all on this, and just sort of stick to kind of notions of right and wrong. But in the law, in, say, the areas of consumer protection, there are a lot of things, you go to the store and you buy something, and there's a huge sort of apparatus of law that you don't need to know, right? You are entitled to know when you buy a product that it's relatively safe. We have law, we have tort law, we have centuries of regulation, whatever, so that when you buy something, I don't know how my car works. I don't know how that pharmaceutical works. I mean, and I shouldn't have to know, right? I mean, it doesn't make sense to say everyone needs to understand these sorts of things. And so from a consumer protection perspective, then we're thinking about how you can add default rules that sort of set up the floor where we can expect certain practices to be out there in the data world, and companies can choose to exceed them. I mean, Google is actually, one of the funny things about Google and the changes they made in their privacy policies, I kind of feel like I got in trouble, partly because they said what they were doing in a way that finally people could understand, and they got nailed for it, which isn't exactly a great incentive to be clear, but they were bucking the trend, and I think they're going to stay being clear. But it's really, really easy to obfuscate, and it's really easy to want to. And so I think, right now, the onus really has to be on the companies and on the regulators and the government to try to establish better baseline, good baseline privacy rules so that we can all serve safely.
So, okay, I'll back off. You guys don't have a homework assignment tonight to go and read our privacy policies. I think that's probably true, although ours is the best. But I do think that you, as a user of these services, need to, when you're looking at it from the concerns around privacy, you need to figure out who you're going to trust. If it's not the vendor themselves, then hopefully it's one of the watchdog groups like the EFF, or there are others that are out there that are absolutely clearly looking at vendors such as Google with your best interest at heart. And you can see by what they did with the Facebook translation, that's an example of that. So, I mean, somewhere you've got to, if you're not going to read them yourself, which I think is a perfectly reasonable assumption and plan, and you're concerned about this stuff, I think you need to look out and at least find some of the credible watchdog groups that you can rely on to give you kind of a straight story on some of these. But I do want to flip the discussion a little bit, right? Because one of the reasons that a company like Google collects data is not just to show more advertising to you and make more revenue. But to be fair, that's part of it, and we want to do that in an acceptable way to our users. But it's also about providing really valuable and useful services to our users, that they are more than willing to share some of their data in order to get those services. For example, we are able to aggregate tremendous amounts of global information in order to deliver things like Google Translate. Right? This is this fantastic online tool that can take anything you write and create, at least a reasonable automated translation in 50, I think it's 57 languages or maybe a little more now. And we offer that to people for free. And fundamentally, we can do that and other things like that because we have this great amount of data. Now, if you're not going to read the policy, which I understand, you certainly should do your best to understand what tools and controls the vendors that you work with may offer you to see what data they have and to understand how you can control what data they have. And so, certainly if you're a Google user, and most people are, I would certainly encourage you to go to google.com/dashboard. And if you've got a Gmail account or if you've got any of our other service accounts, you've logged into our services, you'll have a profile there. And you'll see what we collect and associate with that profile, and you'll have a certain amount of controls over what's visible to others. Now, the reason why it's good for you, on balance, to have an account with us is so that when you search for things on the internet, which is what most people do when they use Google, we can provide you a better set of responses. And yes, some of those responses are paid for advertising. That's why Google's in business, and that's why we're able to do some of the other great things that we can do that are totally free, and in many cases relatively, if not completely ad-free. And I think it's important for you to understand, by looking at the dashboard and by looking at some of the other tools that we can provide, how you can control that data, and sort of you make the decision about how much data do I want to give them versus how much value do I get out of the services by providing that data. Now, it's a little bit of a simplified equation there, but fundamentally, I do think that that's maybe a little more reasonable than actually trying to decipher and understand a bunch of privacy policies. Another great example is when you're using Google Docs and you're sharing a document with someone. Don't you want to have your list of email contacts right there for you to be able to share that document with people that you tend to email with? That's an example of us sharing the information between Gmail and Google Docs in a way that's beneficial to our users. There's all kinds of, I think, very valuable things that we do that a lot of people, when they start to look at it from a privacy perspective, kind of forget about the value of that information being shared amongst the different applications within Google's family of products. So it is a balance that we need to strike, right? These tools are incredibly valuable, incredibly useful to us in our everyday lives. But we do need to understand where do we have the controls and where do we have the visibility into what data is tracked, and apply some control where we think it's appropriate.
Yes, sir.
So I think that I agree with both of them, and I think though that the stress is the privacy starts with you. You're the one that control your data initially to start with. And our stuff, where once you share it, other people share it. But it always started with you giving up your data first. And I think that you have to make good decisions, okay? And you have to make good choices. And let me just tell you a quick example. I went to get a root canal done. My dentist sent me to a new doctor. I got there, they say, fill out this form. I'm filling out the form for a new patient, and they say, what's your SSN? And I looked at him, I said, I'm paying with a credit card. Can't you pre-authorize? If it's good, why do you need to know what my SSN Sam is today. You know, and I got into a row with a girl. She was just a clerk. She didn't know what to do. I said, well, do you have a privacy policy? Out came the privacy policy, and I scanned it real quick. And being more knowledgeable than the average Joe, I said, well, this is good, but it's worthless without a decent security policy to say you can really enforce what you're saying you're trying to do in privacy. Do you have a security policy? Which her eyes got really big. And she didn't know what to do with that one, and my tooth started to hurt. And so then I made a good decision. You know, I'm going to trade a piece of information in order for my tooth to stop hurting. And so we're always going to have to make these decisions, no matter what the privacy policies actually say. You've got to make a good business decision. All you business students must know this. It always comes down to a business decision. What am I paying and what am I getting for the decision? And is it worth it to me at this time? And that's how you should fundamentally do all of these decisions. Because I guarantee you, not everybody's going to have a really easy to read Privacy Act, and I don't read them either. I try to make the best business decision I can. Do I get enough benefit from it?
So, Alec,
If I could, I just want to jump in. Okay, part of the problem here is that I might even if I need to buy a house, or I'm getting applying for a mortgage, I have, at that point, I have no real choice about what they want from me. If I want the house, I'm going to give them my social security number. They're going to see all my accounts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's, in a way, it's not a real choice. But then the question is, so what are they doing with all that information? How are they using it? Who are they telling? Even if I don't have a choice, the ability to exercise control, shouldn't there be some way to understand what's happening there? And one of the things that I think a lot of people don't understand, even as simple as the internet. I mean, how many people in this room know what I mean when I say HTTP refer? Okay, not very many. The fact is that when you follow a link, you go to a website, under the HTTP protocol, the previous site you were on will be visible to the server you just went to. So if you click, you went from EFF's site to the Amazon site. Amazon will see, oh, you just came from EFF. This is actually interesting, right? Because if you were surfing on a porn site and then you went someplace, they'd see you surfed on a porn site. Or maybe you were studying some subject that you might not want anyone else to know. But it's automatically visible. But nobody knows that. And so you can't even control it because you don't have any idea that there's even something to be controlled. And this, again, is part of the information asymmetry problem, which is why I worry about putting too much burden on the individuals, because there's so much that they don't know. And when I talk to professionals in IT, the funny thing is that, it's not funny, it's natural. Professionals in IT know more than other people. And even when they try to scale down their ideas of what everybody knows, they really can't. I mean, they're shocked to know that people don't know things. And then systematically, I think, it sort of skews the picture. So I just worry a lot about the asymmetries.
I want to get one more thing out of Alec, because Alec has to leave to go pick up some children. And I have one more question for him. And we've kind of touched on it a little bit in terms of, there's a lot of talk about privacy records and everybody's going to digital medical records and things like that. And there are lots and lots of policy issues that are associated with that. And, talking a little bit about what Lee was saying about the complexity of some of this stuff. I mean, most people don't know what an HTTP refer is, but they exist. And there's lots of different pieces of technology like that that make the internet work. I wouldn't expect most congressmen and senators have a depth of knowledge sufficient to allow them to understand all that stuff. So how do we, because there's IT professionals in this room and the business professionals that would be out in the business world, how do we access the politicians in an appropriate way to help educate them and help them understand the policy significance of the things that we're talking about?
When Google changed its banner on the Piracy Act, it scared the shit out of a lot of people on Capitol Hill. It was phenomenal. I remember soon, I opened it up, I thought, ooh, there was a big mushroom cloud on the horizon here. It really got people's attention. That's an aphoristic way of saying it's really hard to do in a very in a subtle way. I think part of this is generational. I struggle with my boss to let him know that when you hit send, it doesn't disappear. It's still there. So be careful what you hit send on. This is a challenge for a politician. I think part of it's generational. I mean, you know, in that sort of the level of understanding of how these things work is just you know, it's going to improve. Although, you know, I don't know. I mean, how many, you know, we've had cars for a long time, and you know, I used to work on them all the time. I mean, I do an auto shop, and how many of you have changed valve? You know, if you have a modern car now, I mean, how many of you had your valve head resurfaced and changed it, and fixed head gaskets? I'm looking at blank looks. Probably not. But you know, I went to school in the '80s, and we did that stuff. So you could still do that. I think the challenge with elected officials is, you know, when it's talking about a policymaker, I think it's really talking about this in terms that are as approachable as possible. It's trying to do what EFF did with you know, Facebook's privacy policy. I think there is this intersection here of, again, go back to it's very the actual what is going on is relatively simple. I mean, I know that the technical aspects are very complex, but basically there's a lot of stuff out there, and we have technologies that allow us to gather a lot of stuff. And you know, what do you do with it? I mean, it's the same old, you know, what happened when the, you know, group of hunter-gatherers were walking along, and you know, there was information at the front of the line that the people at the back line didn't know, and how did that information move back and forth across that, you know, 100 yards of the village, walking through the bush, you know? Everybody's running this way. There must be something bad. Run two. You know, it's that basic just village gossip stuff, but it's now much more sophisticated, and the sorry, the question was how do you communicate with Congress? It's a challenge. I mean, I think it's. I don't mean to throw my hands up. I mean, you know, Congress these days isn't a very fact-friendly place, so it's hard to get at really complex policy issues, and I think this is one of those things that has it crosses a lot of ideological boundaries, of traditional ideological boundaries. I think there's a broad interest in privacy. At the same time, you know, there's this sense that you know, there's a big piece, growing piece of our economy that's relying on that. So it's not as if you just want to shut it down. There's also, I think, a broad understanding of the utilities. So it's a challenge to balance the you know, the protection of personal privacy while protecting, still enabling this activity to go along. You know, you know, it's sort of, you know, at the dawn of agriculture, you don't want to outlaw seeds. You know, and so I guess that's right. I don't mean to be glib about it. I'm sort of casting around and saying, what's an effective way to talk to members of Congress? It's always to be simple. Tell a good story. If you can possibly avoid it, don't use PowerPoint. My best PowerPoint story, you know, the military is addicted to PowerPoint. I always think that what you ought to do using DNDC's data mining is you ought to create for every DoD employee a tag on how many times you create a PowerPoint slide. And everybody gets a certain career threshold. And after that, you start losing retirement pay. And that, to me, is a data mining tool that would really make life easier if anyone has to deal with DoD, because you would have one slide instead of 50. But no, I think that this is it's an issue, it's a struggle. I go back to my comment about, you know, the anti-piracy bill. I mean, that grew out of you know, I think some very legitimate concerns about within, you know, people older pieces of the economy that make money out of intellectual property. Hollywood was the kind of marquee, but there's other players, you know, pharmaceutical companies that have patents and so forth. I mean, kind of knows a lot of the pieces there. But I think, you know, the policy starts getting drafted in a silo, you know, where just that interest starts focusing on, here's our problem, how do we fix our problem? And then when folks like Google and then all the blogs and websites out there start realizing, well, what does this actually mean if it applied to us? You know, there's probably it was probably that, you know, conversation in, you know, somewhere in Google or, you know, Facebook, and they said, well, this is really what it means. Holy, you know, insert your creative word. That light bulb moment, and I think that belies the challenge here, because dealing with these privacy policies, you know, you start. You can write pass a law that says, you know, here's the privacy bill of rights. Here are the 8 things in simple language that are out there in public. And you're going, yes, we want to do that. But then, you know, does it create a false sense of security? You know, what are those implications? How do you pursue that? And then you start dealing with this interconnected piece, this balance of benefits and utility in different business. I'm not sure I'm close to answering the question, but it's.
I think you've hit on the complexity of it. I mean, especially, well, I mean, how many people have seen the Coney 2012 video? Okay, there are a number of CIO blogs and things talking now about the clicktivism, right? And how easy it is to be an activist in the social media world when all you have to do is click a button. But how many people actually end up paying attention to that? So I think when we think about members of Congress and we think about, you know, other elected officials, if it's so easy to click on a change.org petition and send an email off to 50 or 60 elected officials, what is the net impact of that versus sitting down and actually writing a letter by hand to an official, making a case?
And having a conversation is really impactful. I mean, I know that sounds hard to do, but it's actually pretty simple. I think the complexity of this issue, we talk about it being complex. I mean, I think it's complex because there's different interests, but ultimately it's a fairly simple problem. I mean, I think the parody about, you know, it's a pretty simple problem. It's just how do you craft policy that strikes, you know, sort of does more good than bad, because any policy you do is going to do good and bad, and you just try to find which, you know, what's the right mix of it. You know, I think I probably like a lot of you. I mean, I hit those little policies and, you know, little, do you accept this? I'm like, yeah, I want what I want. I was like, yeah, sure. You know, instant gratification. I'm like, I'm a lawyer. I'm not good with that. So, you know, it's sort of this acceptance of I'm on the internet. I guess, you know, if I'm walking among thieves, you know, I guess I'm going to have to accept that. And if I don't want that, I shouldn't go on there. But I think there's really 2 types of data we're talking about. There's the internet thing, you know, when we go out and use Google services, and I use Google Translate, I use Google Earth, I mean, this is wonderful. That to me is sort of, I'm part of that world, and that seems to be that's one type of data. The other piece is the medical data, the using the fast track when I'm crossing the bridge data, and when the data with my credit card data, when I access healthcare data, when my health insurance bills for some service that my child has, that data, which seems to be in this data mining thing, conflated. And I think there's sort of a sense of trying to peel that apart and understand, you know, not all data is created equal, and that going back to that, the kids borrowing stuff. You know, if I'm giving you my lunch, kindergarten, I want it back. It's a little different than just, you know, just talking a joke. I mean, I'm bad metaphor, but I'm trying to separate out, and from a policy standpoint, most of the existing federal policy in a patchwork way deals with the latter kind of data, the Privacy Act, the kinds of things that are key Privacy Act data, not the, or just our footprint on the internet kind of data. But
I'm going to jump in and comment on 2 things that you said that I think are true. And The principles that we all, I think, ascribe to in this area are quite simple, and I think the way that Lee laid them out are great. I think that it doesn't take a lot of digging before the complexity comes up, right? Because everybody has their own individual spectrum of what they think is right and what they think is wrong, and most of what they do is kind of somewhere in the middle, not obviously right, not obviously wrong. And then, of course, all the companies, all the vendors have a similar type of spectrum in terms of what they do and how they define their policies and practices for handling the data that their users entrust them with. So you sort of have these, intermingling, interleaved, non-discrete, non-analog spectrums of this thing. And all of a sudden, it's a very complex situation when you actually put it into practice. I think it's always good to go back to these simplified principles when you kind of have a question about whether or not what you're doing is the right thing to do. So I think it's good to have those in mind. And we have a set of them in Google that we do all of our stuff around the privacy principles that we use. I'm not going to iterate them for you here, but if you come up to me afterwards, I'll share them with you. I think that again, somewhere you have to sort of figure out who you're going to trust and then monitor them. I mean, I guess it was Reagan's trust but verify, and I think Lee makes a very good point that we need better abilities to verify, and we need watchdog groups as well as individual consumers and to some degree regulators, to sort of help identify what things vendors and the markets need to do to enable the transparency and enable the ability to verify what's going on. Another thing to remember when we look at the legislative body and kind of expect them to do things is that fundamentally in this country, I think we believe in limiting regulation, and a big part of that is fostering innovation and economic development that comes from that, right? And that's why Google's here, that's why Facebook is here, that's why IBM and Microsoft of yesterday's generation are here as well, because some very smart people got together and relatively unfettered by regulation were able to create these fantastic technologies that produced great commercial and business models. So I certainly understand the notion that because some of these technical things are complex and because the issues themselves can be complex, we want someone to come in and just kind of fix it for us. And I think the point that Alec made about the government and the legislation, the regulators really focusing on the truly sensitive and critical piece of information, healthcare information, financial information, the stuff that is used to make decisions about hiring and firing, all of that stuff. I think that's very logical for them to try to protect. I think it becomes, again, very difficult when you get into some of these grayer areas that Alex went about, sort of your digital footprint on the internet, which has a lot of personal information, but still that personal information might not be classified as sensitive and protected like healthcare and financial information is. So there's definitely a lot of challenges out there, but it is really important to understand, again, as best you can, what is the data that's being collected, how is it being used, and what types of controls do you have on the data that's out there. I will give a little bit of a plug. We've invested a lot of effort and money in an educational campaign. It's called Good to Know, and it kind of explains some of the basic stuff like HTTP refer and what a cookie is and how it's used. And I certainly encourage the legislators to have a look at that too, and that will help them understand why when they click send, it's still there. But I mean, again, this is complicated stuff. This is absolutely beyond what I think a lot of people want to know. But I think you have to, if you're concerned, if you're interested, I think we've, with this campaign, really tried to create something that's pretty simple and approachable and easy to understand, and is a great starting point. So again, it's good to know. I think it's either goodtoknow.com or Google/goodtoknow. If you just search it on a search engine of your choice, you'll find it.
Alec, I know you need to go, so I'd like to thank you for being here, and you can still help. We've got about 20 minutes or so.
Ask questions, come on.
So what I'd like to do is open up the mics for questions. Don't all line up at once.
How you guys doing? As far as the patenting of biological organisms as they're discovered and made, how would you guys comment on that and the ethical dilemma as far as the legal issues concerning it?
Can you repeat the question?
Just university studies and other pharmaceutical companies are patenting new organisms as they're discovered, essentially keeping other people from making the specific gene or whatever it is. And so that goes all the way up to the human level, which it's not done, but the smaller microbial level.
Yeah, I mean, I'm afraid that all I can say is that since I'm not an intellectual property lawyer and not a patent lawyer, you can't really, you can sort of patent organisms, and this is a problem in the sense of depriving, society of things or creating a monopoly around something that could be extremely useful. We have a decision just come down in the Prometheus versus Mayo case, though that's rather interesting. Because that was a case involving some kind of test, a very simple test actually, for presence of some kind of chemical in the body. And this company tried to patent it, and yet they really were trying to patent nothing more than a, kind of like litmus paper. Here's how basic or acid this is. Here's how much of this stuff is in the body. And the Supreme Court said you cannot, it's always said this, but you can't patent a law of nature. And so this is causing then some of the other very interesting biological patents, like in the Myriad case, which involved the patents for testing on the BC1 and 3, I think, breast cancer gene. That test, that lawsuit's just gone back down to be reconsidered in light of this law of nature position. So, there's always this tension, we've talked about it before, between how do you stimulate innovation. Well, one way to stimulate innovation is to allow folks to be able to have a temporary monopoly or temporary control of something, but then at some point you have to act, and also have to balance it out and feed the public domain by letting that, taking it outside of control. And in a way, privacy has the same sort of, in a lot of the online areas, we know Google can do amazing things like, let's say, Google Blue Trends, other kinds of really, really interesting analysis of data. On the other hand, does that data need to be identified to people? Does that how much location does there need to be in it? How long do they need to keep it? All these kinds of questions always come up, and right now we're in sort of a wild, wild west situation. I'm not sure that fully answers your question.
Sort of, yeah, most of it.
Go ahead. One other quick thing. Having been sued over patents of violating patents, I learned an interesting fact about patents that I hadn't known before. I just wanted to share with you, is that you can get a patent and you can charge people for participating in using your patent, but not until it's tested in the court is it really yours, where you get the court to say, yes, it's your patent. So you have to depend on competitors out there to say, hey, no, you shouldn't be able to patent that. This is public domain. And to challenge it in court to make sure to prevent such things as patenting organisms and things like that. It truly is public domain.
So I'm not a lawyer at all, so I have to say that. I can't comment on your specific example, but my personal take, and I believe my company's take on this, is that the patent system was created with good intentions and it's gone horribly wrong, right? And we're embroiled in a ton of patent lawsuits that I think even non-lawyers would look at and say, well, what do you mean you have a patent for an electronic catalog on the internet? That actually was my previous employer. But there's all these patents that have been granted for these sort of generic things that all kinds of companies already do, and there's an incredible legal economy that's being generated over battling over these things. And I know that my current employer feels very strongly that that is very stifling to innovation, because we're not able to do all the things that we'd like to do, and we're involved in these. There's a ton of companies that simply buy patents from other companies that are going bankrupt and are trying to sell them, and they buy them with the explicit intent of going and suing businesses. Now, again, the concept seems reasonable. If you actually create something new and innovative, you should have some sort of right and privilege to be the marketer and the seller and the benefit reaper of that. But it's clearly gone too far in the direction that it is right now. And I think this may be another example. Again, I don't really know the details.
So there's an altruistic part of this too. I've worked with several companies that have patent things, and then they put it in the public domain after they patent them, and they do that against being sued by somebody else saying, you stole my idea. So first they patent it, prove it's theirs, then they put it in the public domain and let everybody have it, rather than hold on to it and make a lot of money on it. They're just trying to protect themselves before, so they won't get sued out of the situation. So there is an altruistic way.
But of course the challenge there is that if it is truly a competitive, distinctive advantage, then they can't, make the type of economic success that they could have otherwise. So, I mean, it's tricky. It's a tricky situation, right? I mean, we are fundamentally a society that values commerce and economic growth and job creation that comes from some of this innovation. So there's a balance there. It's tough, but it certainly seems to me that those types of examples are great. I think they're generally the exception, and we've got far more examples of things that I think from a layman's perspective just look kind of ridiculous.
Thank you.
I was wondering if any of the panelists would comment on what's going on in the world internationally. I've read several articles about the Chinese government hacking into American systems, and not the Chinese alone, but I've also read articles about Russians and citizens who do this, and governments that encourage it or governments that actually actively promote it. Is there anything going on in the UN or in treaties or policies that would address the issues of how to protect, I don't know, and I know this goes on in the business world as well, so is there anything that's going on that would provide a platform for agreements? Are there any policies being proposed or generated that would address some of these hacking issues?
I don't know specifically if there are any legal policies that are being formulated, but I can tell you that in academia, that's an ongoing threat. You mentioned business and other sectors, but this is a persistent threat in the world. And what we've tried to do to combat the problem is not to wait for a policy or a new regulation, but rather to work together as universities across not just this nation, but across the world, to identify these threats very early and then take stances against them. As I mentioned before, there's a flip side to security. It is indeed a complex discipline. Privacy protection and security takes an awful lot of work. But the good news is that those of us, particularly in academia, we're working together collaboratively. We've heard the word trust mentioned quite a bit in this panel. We are learning to trust one another. We're learning to share bits of information that we wouldn't have shared in the past. We're learning to dive into what's happening across the nation and other universities. And again, trying to learn from their experiences so that we can avoid similar problems in our own world.
Well, I understand the government is particularly inept, even the Pentagon, in protecting its own systems. So, hopefully we've got some congressional committees and something going on where I do think to some extent it is a generational issue. People don't, as Mr. Tien was commenting, people don't really understand well enough to formulate the questions or look at the issues of what it is they need to do or what it is that they're protecting. And in addition to government-sponsored hacking and commercial hacking, there's also criminal organizations plus terrorism that present some real serious questions that seem to be where individuals in this field seem constantly challenged to play catch up with these very focused goals of people to, and groups like Anonymous, political protesters, etc. So it seems to me like you guys have a real challenge. So,
but again, we are not going to make the policy. It takes too long. I have the opportunity to sit down and meet with a number of individuals from various branches of the military to talk about the cyber threat. And I can tell you that they acknowledge that it is very real. And they are taking steps to develop a force, if you will, to help address this problem at a national level. And certainly they're partnering with their colleagues and other branches of government across the world to address this as a collaborative effort, much like, as I said, we're doing in academia. No one of us can handle this problem on ourselves.
Does it have to do with encrypting information and creating, as you were commenting on, agreements where certain rules and guidelines, and it seems to me it might be difficult to implement a verification system, but what other direction can you go than to build collaborative arrangements and maybe encrypt information?
All of that is part of a long line of defense. Encryption, agreements, policy, other types of controls. No single controller can solve our problem, to be perfectly honest with you. What we have to do and what we are doing is developing comprehensive strategies that include the discussions, the trusted networks, the encryption protocols, tokenization, et cetera, et cetera. So it's complex because there's so many moving parts. And again, our job is to figure out what controls make sense given the moving parts.
And how much of a priority do you feel this is in your industry, in your security industry, in your
That's right up
privacy
there.
industry?
I heard one of our generals speak not too long ago, and he was listing the top 5 threats, and cybersecurity was right up there at the top of the list.
Yeah, I mean, if I could jump in. I mean, it's in terms of the government, Congress, there are like 3 or 4 major cybersecurity bills on the Hill right now, and we expect to see them, at least 1 or 2 of them, moved to the floors of their respective houses within the next month or so. So cybersecurity indeed is a big, big headline issue in DC. I think a week or 2 ago was Cybersecurity Week. People are doing all sorts of things to try to get some kind of cybersecurity legislation moving. That said, I have to put in place, we don't like the bills. I mean, we think that most of them are not going to help very much. A lot of the problem in this area, and I wish I could hear, because I think that there is a tendency to take a top-line headline view and say, oh, there's a problem, and then to throw sort of simple ideas at it, which may often have issues, and at the same time, without recognizing what are some of the root problems. For instance, we think about being attacked, but part of the problem that we face with our cybersecurity is the insecurity of the commercial off-the-shelf software that people use, right? If your operating system is exploitable, contains weaknesses, and bots can deposit any kind of malware on your computer, then you're going to have these giant botnets. And it's already, and that threat exists. Similarly, on with the internet, it's hard to defend against distributed denial, against denial of service attack. The protocol is supposed to, you're accepting these packets, so then you get flooded. And the best thing you can do is try to figure out where you're coming from and to start to block them. There are things that we don't have the technology to really sort of directly do. But, part of what we see is not always a great attention to the effectiveness or to the risk, to the threat profiles. And so the things that we don't like in the current bills will be like, oh, we need to have more monitoring, we need to have more surveillance, we need to have everyone be able to read every packet that crosses their networks, just in case there's some sort of a threat signature. And then at the same time, the word threat signature or threat indicator is defined so broadly, you have no idea what it means. And so it's really emblematic of the general problem of Congress sort of wants to do the right thing, but they don't know exactly how. And then as it gets written, it just doesn't necessarily work very well. And so, groups like mine will scream about it, but people will think that we're trying to say there's no problem. We're not saying there's no problem. We're just saying that what you're trying to do might actually put the internet worse than.
Well, at least it sounds like there's bipartisan support for this, which is unusual. I see another question here. So just as a corollary to the questions I was asking, do you see anything on the horizon that presents problems with proposed policies that would limit speech or compromise individual rights of expression or exchange of data?
Yeah, I think that right now, the way that some of these bills are written, they would be very threatening to speech on the internet.
Yeah, I'm just going to add one thing. Cybersecurity is an absolutely significant and strategic problem, I think Cheryl made the point that our military rates it clearly in the top 3, and for some in the military it's the #1 threat. I think it's great if we write more legislation in the U.S. I don't think other countries really care about the legislation that we write, and furthermore, they're not actually subject to the jurisdiction. So this is an incredibly challenging problem. Some of you may know that we actually, Google made a decision to essentially stop censoring our search results, which was a requirement of doing business with the Chinese government. That's what they required us to do. And we had sort of, grudgingly agreed in order to be able to do business there. Subsequently, I think this is now almost 2 years ago, we disclosed to the public that we had detected and uncovered an attack that we believe was sponsored by some form of the Chinese government. And at that point, we made the sort of the business decision to stop doing things the way that government wanted us to do it and stop filtering our results. Subsequently, they have firewalled off all of Google searches, so you can't really do a Google search in China anymore. That is our company, sort of making a stand on principle about what we think is going on in relation to Nolan's comments about, essentially what we identified as nation-state sponsored cyber terrorism. This is not a problem that's going away. If anything, as our dependency on the internet and on technology grows, this problem and this threat will grow. I am, to some degree, encouraged by a lot of the things that Cheryl talked about and some of the things that I think Lee mentioned, although we do have to really be careful here because there are those that will try to seize this opportunity to truly do things that could invade our private and personal rights, right? A lot of these things come across as being designed to protect our security against things like cyber terrorism, but really open the door for a broad number of people to then be able to see, for example, what you may be searching for. That's just one example, right? And while that in and of itself may not be classified as an invasion of privacy, it's what they start to do with it, and then what you start to do in reaction to that, right? You don't want to do something that you used to do in your normal life that was perfectly legal and reasonable, and now you don't want to do it because you're afraid that someone is watching it and may be able to extract it and do something with it. So it's a really, really challenging issue. I will try to bring it back to maybe the title of the panel and say, I definitely believe it's not ethical for any of these nation states to engage in this activity, but they do it nonetheless.
And if you haven't figured out, if you're looking for a job with security, career security, and cyber security is a good place to start.
Growth industry.
Dr. Simmons.
Never a dull moment.
Thank you. A couple years ago, I came home from work, and there was a letter in the mail from my alma mater, the University of California. And it said, "Dear Dr. Simmons, our records indicate you were a graduate student at UC Berkeley between year X and year Y. One of our employees went home with a laptop with had data on it, included your social security number, and he lost the laptop, and we don't know what happened to your social security number. We're very sorry. I want to check with the various credit bureaus to make sure that your credit's still good." So my question is twofold, one to Cheryl and one to Cheryl and Chip. One, why does the University of California, it was a long time ago and I was first a grad student, why does the University of California still need to keep my social security number? And two, perhaps of great interest to the students here, what steps are current institutions of higher learning take to protect the data that you're collecting now from them?
The good news is I probably wasn't on board with that letter. So I didn't write it. But I have written my share of letters very similar to that, and it's a really good fundamental question. We often don't know exactly why a particular employee has a laptop that contains unencrypted, personally identifiable information. We have tried to write policies, we've tried to educate, raise awareness, but it happens, and it's probably the worst thing that could possibly happen, because as you look back and you've gone through a number of these experiences as I have, you ask yourself, why are we still doing this? Truly, why? And it really breaks my heart, truly, that I have to go through this experience, and I'll likely probably go through it a few more times before we finally catch on. And that's a true admission. It shouldn't happen. Truly. The second part of your question is, why does the university retain SSNs or other personally identifiable data elements? I think the answer that I've been told in the past, and I ask these questions as a security professional, I want to know why we are collecting this information. I want to know where it's being stored. I want to know who's touching it. I want to know when we can get rid of it. But I think part of the answer is that there are some government laws or state laws that require institutions such as those of us in academia to hold information for a period of time. And Chip may be able to weigh in a little bit on this one as well. But we have a legal requirement to hold this information once we've collected it. And SSN is part of an earlier record that we established on students. And unfortunately, we do have a fair number of records that still contain social security numbers.
And that's changing. Up until, what, 6 years ago?
Yeah.
It was about 6 years ago the state of California passed legislation that prohibits the use of social security number as a primary identifier for student records, which is why you all now have e-SIDs, and now you have MOIDs, and we have lots of different IDs now that we use, and so PeopleSoft uses a different primary key. So the reason that Berkeley probably kept your social security number was that was your primary identifier, and they had no other mechanism to identify the records, and so that just continued on through time, and someone had access to it to download it. In our current configuration, there are an extraordinarily limited number of employees who have access to SSN to even download it to a laptop to begin with. So we've done as much as we can to reduce the likelihood that it can be extracted from our systems of record. What they could download would be your student ID number, which is not your social number. So there are measures that we've taken, and part of it has been legislative because we had no other primary key to use for people. The other bits of it that make it difficult are, for example, when you first get your username and password, and we need to assign you a temporary password, we need to have certain identifying information that only you know, so that not every Tom, Dick, and Harry can log into your email account and start sending email to you. But yet we're also prohibited from using date of birth as a mechanism to identify people. So it gets very tricky in terms of maintaining your privacy and securing systems so that only authorized people get access to them. So, last question, and then I think we're about done.
Okay. There's about like half a dozen people recording us without our consent right now. Okay. So how are we personally responsible for that information, and how are the third parties that receive that information responsible for it?
Just to be clear, I signed the consent form.
I mean, I'm saying, people other than the people you explicitly told that could record you.
It's just the fact that we're being recorded here, and how did these people know what's going to happen with the guy with the iPad in the back and this camera over here?
This is one of the. I'm going to use that question. I mean, one of the things that's really difficult in modern era is distinguishing between what's private and what's public. And you can ask people, well, we're all here in what is ostensibly a public place. So under California law, for instance, no one would think that you have reasonable expectation of privacy in this information. And then we get into one of the even thornier areas of privacy law, which is how privacy law intersects with your right to speak freely and to write freely. Because in the public sort of domain, one of my friends what I don't really agree with, but at the same time the way he puts it is a nice way of putting it. It is sort of, he's not a big privacy guy, so he often calls the right to privacy the right to keep other people from talking about you, which is, and we all think we have, or we do have, the free speech right to talk about us, other people, but at the same time, there are privacy laws, and this is a clash in this area that makes it very difficult. It's particularly interesting, though, when you think about sort of being in public and the sorts of things where you are in public, you really don't have any choice, and you're not saying it in a public place. Like Google's vans, and Google's not the only company that has vans wandering around the street recording things about the world. I'm working on a bill right now in the state legislature, which is trying to control the practices of a company called Vigilant Video. What does Vigilant Video do? It has vans. It came out of the Repo Man
industry, and it does asset recovery, which means car recovery, which means they go and look for your car if you're deadbeat and sees it, right? Well, they've equipped these vans with automatic license plate readers that scan. So what do? They drive around the streets of the United States and, you know, with their cameras and just record every license plate that they see. It gets converted by OCR into a digital file. And so if they drove down my street, they'd see my car. They'd like see that license plate and track it to my, you know, my location in Berkeley. They do that all over the place. There's a Supreme Court case, right? The Jones, United States versus Jones, about GPS tracking of cars on you know, public streets. And one of the shifts that's happening now, because in the old days we used to say, if it's in public, you have no privacy in it. Get over it. One of the things that data mining and big data, because we're able to collect so much more, and we're able to analyze it so much more, people are beginning to realize that can't be right. Because our notion in 1968 that if you did it in public, it's okay for someone to, you know, to talk about it, also sort of assumed that everything wasn't being recorded. But when everything is being recorded, then what that means that they can, you know, people can pull up this amazing amount of data, and then they can do all sorts of stuff. So the Supreme Court said that, yeah, you know, if you are following someone's car using this GPS tracker, and it's recording the movements of that car 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 30 days, that's too much. The police actually need to have some kind of, I won't say warrant, because the case doesn't go that far, but they actually have to have a justification to be able to track it, even though all that movement's in public and anyone can see it, because they can connect the dots with technology in a way that you couldn't have a long time ago. So I mean, the whole area of public and private is actually being problematized or sort of being challenged by the very things you've been talking about today.
Actually, we'll let the last question, I think.
It's kind of in direct relation to that. There was a case recently in France, I believe, with Google recording a man in his front yard peeing with one of their streetcars. Do you know what the outcome of that is, or what it will be?
Sorry, this is the case. It wasn't the case. There's actually a website that you can go to that has all of the people who spend their time searching Google Street View for interesting and unique images that are captured.
So I don't know anything about that case specifically, but we do have a very clear policy about removing stuff like that. If you feel that you know, Street View has captured a picture of you that is inappropriate in some way, you make a request and we review it and we'll take it down. I actually had an ex-coworker, a colleague of mine, send me an email inquiring about that process because the picture in front of her house showed her and her child leaving her house. Now the faces are blurred, that's something that we do automatically, but she felt that that was, you know, a little too much information. She didn't want her and her son being shown in her driveway, and so I directed her to the process, and she went through it, and that image got replaced with something else. So I think what Chip said is right. I mean, the fact of the matter is, again, this is tons of data that's being collected. That's a great one to debate whether or not it's in the public or not, because anyone else that was driving by in their car would have seen that. Why is it different? Well, it's different because we're aggregating it, we're making it fairly easily accessible, and so that's why we have to enable things like the process to give some control back to those people and say, if you want to remove that picture of you doing something that you didn't want to be seen doing, and it showed up in Street View, then we can do that.
And I'll go back to my kindergarten notion of privacy, which is they didn't ask first, did they? Right? I mean, in the cases we're talking about, no one's asking us. I mean, it seems to me that if you're a person in front of your house and somebody is going to put a picture, put that image up on the internet, that it would be nice to be asked. And there's a presumptuousness to these actions where the pattern is, yes, now you have a problem with it, then you can't take it down. I'm not saying that that's always going to be the answer, but I'd like to think from that and say, okay, why couldn't you have asked for it? One of my colleagues was sort of a poster child for this Street View probably, because he had told his parents that he had quit smoking. And wouldn't you know it, Google Street View happened to have a picture of him, catch a picture of him and put it up, smoking a cigarette. And, that was an unpleasant way to be, eventually somebody's son told his parents he got out in that way.
So I do want to just come back with one thing. I'm not going to say the notion of us asking is right or wrong. What I will say is that if we have to ask everybody, there would be no Street View.
So with that is a perfect place to end, because my final thought kind of has been, as we talk about privacy and we talk about what companies and the government are doing with our data, we bear a certain responsibility for the loss of control over all of this. How many folks ran out a week or so ago and bought new iPads? They sold 3 million of the things in one day. Our thirst for these new technologies and these new services and our demand to have these conveniences, to have Street View, to have Google Maps tell us exactly where to go turn by turn, we drive that. We buy these products, we ask for these products, we give feedback on these products every time we use them. And so I think as we walk away from this thinking about the ethics of it, we also bear a certain responsibility as consumers of all of those products. With that, there you go.
Again, thank you so much. As we, Chip, you did a wonderful job moderating. I really do appreciate it. As we draw the 10th Annual Ethics Panel Forum to a close, I'd like to thank two of my colleagues who made this possible. I stand up here and do all the talking, but there's some people behind the scenes that made it possible. One is Kathy Koo, our accounting professor. Kathy, please stand up. And the other person is someone that I've got to know very, very well over the last 2.5 months, and that's Kevin Cahill, who's assistant professor. Kevin is a wonderful digital design professor. I've seen some of his work, and it's just truly marvelous. So, again, thank you for sharing that with me as well, Kevin, and more success in the future in this area. I would also ask that Dean Simmons come up. Oh, he's right here. Excellent. And I'd like to have him present the certificates to each one of our panelists, and as well as our guest speakers, who's made today so memorable. So, Alec, of course, has left us, but Cheryl Washington, again, thank you so much for joining us. I really do appreciate it. And Bill Boogess, I'm glad that you were able to make it as well. I think I'll remember the trade-off between pain and data trade. That's a good one. That was a real good idea. And of course, next to him is Adam Swidler from Google. And of course, all of us know Google, don't we? Because our mail system's on Google. And so thank you very much for providing our mail service.
Being a customer.
Welcome. And last but not, well, not quite last, but Lee Tien, thank you for joining us today. I think Lee's comments were highly provocative, and it gave us an understanding of what to keep in mind as we think about the issues of balancing public versus private information. And many of you hopefully have taken notes. I would recommend that you look at their website. There's some wonderful information there that will help you do your reflective papers. And then last but not least, Chip, come on up. Chip is not only our moderator, but he's a wonderful CIO for the campus. And we just are delighted to have him. He's usually behind the scenes, not in front of on the stage, but we do appreciate what he has meant to this campus. and all of the work that he does to maintain the equipment on this campus, keep us safe as much as we can, and then also be a spokesperson for making sure that we have the latest and greatest equipment. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. I know many of you have questions, and probably burning ones, that you'd like to ask our panelists. So we are going to adjourn to the back of the room. Things are ready. We like to have everything in the same room. And our panelists, I'm sure, will join us for a few minutes, and we'll be delighted to answer any questions that you might have. So again, let's conclude the 10th annual panel, and thank you for coming.